A severed head can remain conscious for as long as 30 seconds following decapitation. This grotesque final half-minute may involve blinking eyes, lips attempting to articulate words, and a lingering awareness as life gradually ebbs away. For Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII and arguably the most renowned beheaded queen in history, this horrifying possibility was merely one facet of her execution that contemporary narratives often sanitize. The true account of Anne's last moments unveils a psychological torment that is far more unsettling than a mere swing of the sword. It was a calculated political spectacle aimed at obliterating not only her physical form but also her enduring legacy. Anne's execution serves as a testament to Tudor England's merciless justice system, where death was simply the culmination of a meticulously orchestrated humiliation. While numerous history texts merely state that she was executed for treason, the reality of her final days encompasses a psychological dismantling so systematic that it would astonish even today's torturers. Her execution was not merely an end, it was the concluding act in Henry VIII's endeavor to erase a woman who had become too powerful for his liking. By May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn had already suffered 17 days of confinement in the Tower of London, the very fortress where she had once prepared for her coronation. Just 3 years prior, she had been crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Now she awaited her death in a peculiar limbo, her execution repeatedly postponed as Henry VIII cruelly prolonged her psychological torment. The king had even summoned a skilled swordsman from Calais to carry out the execution instead of employing the traditional English axe. A detail often portrayed as an act of mercy, yet it merely highlighted the theatricality of what was to unfold. During her final hours and displayed an almost unnatural tranquility described by observers as cheerful even as she readied herself for death. Modern psychologists might interpret this as dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism. The mechanism activated by extreme trauma led her to reportedly joke that she would be remembered as Anne, devoid of a head, exhibiting gallows humor that concealed her inner distress. Few historical records recognize the profound fear she must have experienced, aware that her reputation was being systematically dismantled through false allegations of adultery, incest, and conspiracy to murder the king. What renders Anne's execution particularly unsettling is not merely the act of beheading itself, but the methodical obliteration of her identity. Henry did not simply desire Anne's death, he aimed to erase her from history, nullifying her contributions and delegitimizing her daughter, Elizabeth. The execution represented the climax of a character assassination campaign intended to rationalize to the English populace why their once-adored queen merited such a fate. In the days leading up to her demise, Anne was compelled to listen to scandalous, fabricated narratives regarding her supposed sexual immorality, accusations so absurd they would be dismissed by any contemporary court. The morning of May 19 arrived unusually bright for London, starkly contrasting the grim events that were about to transpire. Anne had spent her last night in prayer, though sleep continually evaded her. Tower records reveal that she requested the sacrament at 2 a.m., kneeling before the host for hours in a desperate communion. By dawn, she had been awake for nearly 24 hours, her mind undoubtedly fractured by stress and fatigue. When the Tower's lieutenant came to escort her, she was reportedly laughing with her ladies, a response that reflects not tranquility but psychological collapse. Anne's execution had been scheduled and rescheduled multiple times, an often ignored form of psychological torment. The uncertainty of not knowing precisely when death would arrive was a deliberate strategy employed against prisoners. When she was finally informed that the time had come, and was led from her chambers through corridors where just 3 years earlier, she had been processed as queen. Now, guards surrounded her, not out of respect, but to prevent her escape. The same courtiers who had once bowed before her now observed her final walk with calculated indifference. The scaffold erected on Tower Green was unusually low, standing just 3 feet off the ground, contrary to the towering platforms often depicted in films. This deliberate design choice forced Anne to ascend only a few steps, robbing her of the dignity of elevation and keeping her closer to the jeering crowd. While modern portrayals often depict a solemn and respectful gathering, historical records suggest that a carnival-like atmosphere had been encouraged. The execution was, after all, public theater, a warning to anyone who might challenge the king's authority, particularly women who dared to rise above their station. Before kneeling at the block, Anne was allowed a final speech, not out of mercy, but because tradition demanded it. Her carefully measured words revealed both her political acumen and her desperate circumstances. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. For according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." This apparent submission to her fate was, in fact, her final act of rebellion. By acknowledging the law while not admitting guilt, she subtly challenged the legitimacy of the charges against her. Most disturbing, perhaps, was the king's absence. Unlike the public representation of royal, Henry VIII did not attend the executions, instead waiting at Whitehall Palace for confirmation of Anne's death. Even as the sword severed her head from her body, Henry was reportedly celebrating his forthcoming marriage to Jane Seymour, a brutal testament to how completely Anne had been discarded. The personal had become political, and Anne's death was merely an inconvenient necessity in the king's quest for a male heir. The swordsman from Killala specifically requested and was compensated with a substantial sum for his expertise, representing another level of calculated cruelty. Traditional English beheadings employed an axe which often necessitated multiple blows to completely sever the head. The French swordsman, while more likely to achieve decapitation in a single stroke, was unfamiliar to Anne. In her final moments, she would confront death at the hands of a stranger, a final indignity for a queen who had once commanded the attention of all England. Her blindfolding, often portrayed as an act of mercy to spare her the sight of the sword, actually served a more practical purpose. It prevented her from flinching at the crucial moment, which could lead to a botched execution. And knelt upright rather than placing her head on a block, adhering to another French tradition that heightened the executioner's challenge. This position compelled Anne to remain still through sheer will, maintaining her composure even as the swordsman readied his strike. Witnesses reported that she continuously moved her lips in prayer, her eyes darting beneath the blindfold as she strained to detect any sound of the approaching blade. The psychological torment of this moment, knowing death was imminent but not knowing when, represents a form of torture rarely experienced. Acknowledged in sanitized historical accounts, the actual beheading was remarkably clean by Tudor standards. A single stroke severed Anne's head. However, what transpired immediately afterward is frequently omitted from polite historical narratives. According to witness accounts, her eyes and lips continued to move for several seconds post-decapitation, a horrifying physiological response that occurs when oxygen remains in the brain tissue. Some accounts even suggest that her lips formed words, perhaps continuing the prayer that was interrupted by the sword's blow. The scene was so disturbing that several witnesses fainted, while others turned away in horror at this grim reminder of the fragile connection between body and soul. Perhaps most tellingly, no proper coffin had been prepared for Anne's remains. Her ladies-in-waiting, overcome with grief and horror, had to scramble to find an arrow chest in which to place her head and body. This seemingly minor oversight speaks volumes about the complete disregard for Anne's dignity. Even in death, she was an afterthought, a political problem resolved rather than a human being deserving of basic respect. She was hastily buried in an unmarked grave within the Tower Chapel without a proper Christian ceremony, as though the king hoped her memory would fade as quickly as her life had ended. Henry's determination to erase Anne extended beyond her death. Court painters were instructed to destroy her portraits, her royal emblems were chiseled from palace walls, and courtiers quickly learned that mentioning her name was frowned upon. The potential for royal disfavor loomed large. While our attention is frequently directed towards the physical act of execution, the systematic eradication of Anne's very existence signifies a form of violence that surpassed her death in endeavor to eliminate not merely a person but a legacy. It would take centuries for historians to embark on the meticulous task of piecing together Anne's life from the remnants that survived Henry's purge. Furthermore, Anne's execution inflicted trauma upon those who were compelled to witness it, particularly her ladies-in-waiting, who were tasked with cleaning and preparing her severed head for burial. These women, themselves fearful of being implicated in the Queen's supposed crimes, were forced to carry out this gruesome duty while maintaining their composure. Several reportedly endured nightmares for years afterward, and at least one ultimately sought refuge in a convent, unable to continue her life at court after the horrors she had witnessed. The far-reaching effects of psychological trauma extended well beyond Anne herself, fostering a climate of fear that permeated Henry's court for the remainder of his reign. In the immediate aftermath of the execution, Anne's daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. The child who would eventually become England's most illustrious queen was effectively left orphaned, her mother executed and her father publicly renouncing her legitimacy. Court records indicate that Elizabeth was abruptly deprived of appropriate clothing and attendance befitting her former status, as her household disbanded almost overnight. This cruel treatment of a toddler represents yet another facet of the horror surrounding Anne's execution, with the punishment extending even to her innocent child. Most contemporary portrayals of Tudor executions, the overwhelming sensory experience was not captured. The scaffold would have been rife with the blood from prior executions buzzing with flies in the warmth of May. The crowd's roar, manipulated by planted supporters instructed to cheer for the Queen's death, created a wall of sound intended to disorient and terrify. This cacophony would have grown louder as she neared Tower Green, accompanied by jeers and catcalls from a populace encouraged to perceive her as a witch and an adulteress. This meticulously orchestrated public humiliation was a crucial element of Tudor justice. Death alone was never deemed sufficient punishment. Popular culture frequently romanticizes Anne's final speech as a moment of dignified defiance, yet historical records indicate a more complex reality. Her carefully crafted address, in which she praised the king as a gentle and sovereign lord, reflects the untenable position she found herself in. Even in the face of imminent death, Anne was unable to speak freely. Her words were constrained by her concern for her daughter's future and the reactions of the observing crowd. Her speech symbolizes not freedom of expression but rather its antithesis. The ultimate censorship of a woman who understood that even her last words would be reported to the king and could affect those she would leave behind. The sword that ended Anne's life, specially imported from France, represents the performative nature of her execution. Henry spared no expense to create a spectacle befitting a queen's downfall. The executioner himself reportedly practiced on animals beforehand, determined to achieve the clean single stroke that would secure him his substantial fee. This cold professionalism, reducing Anne's death to a technical challenge, exemplifies the dehumanization inherent in state-sanctioned execution. Anne was not merely killed. She was processed through a system designed to convert human suffering into political messaging. Contemporary accounts it is noted that no English executioner would undertake the task, not due to any moral objections, but because the French sword technique necessitated specialized training. The blade was exceptionally sharp and had a different weight compared to an English axe, which was designed for a quick horizontal strike rather than the downward chop characteristic of an axe. This technical aspect highlights the theatricality surrounding Anne's execution. The method of death was meticulously chosen to ensure maximum impact and minimal mess, allowing the spectacle to unfold without the undesirable complications of a failed beheading. After the sword descended, witness Thomas Wyatt, who was imprisoned in the Tower and compelled to observe the execution of a woman he had once held in high regard, wrote about the delicate throat that had adorned itself with numerous jewels. His poetic lament encapsulates the grotesque metamorphosis of and from a crowned queen to an objectified corpse. The severed head was promptly wrapped in linen by her mourning ladies, but not before the executioner raised it by the hair, a traditional gesture intended to signify the completion of the sentence to the onlookers. This moment of display, with blood still flowing from the severed arteries, served as the climactic image that would be etched in the memories of those who witnessed it. Records from the Tower indicate that Anne's remains were interred so hastily that proper Christian burial rites were almost entirely disregarded. The arrow chest containing her head and body was placed beneath the chapel floor alongside other executed nobles, marking an ignominious end for a Queen of England. No marker was established to denote her grave's location, and for centuries, the precise site of her burial remained a mystery. This erasure of even her final resting place signifies the culmination of Henry's efforts to eliminate, and not only from life but also from history itself, a campaign that came perilously close to succeeding. In the days that followed, the execution of Anne Boleyn was meticulously orchestrated by Henry's propagandists, who sought to manipulate the public narrative. Court poets, who had previously lauded Anne's intelligence and beauty, now composed verses that denounced her as a scheming adulteress. Official accounts highlighted the king's mercy in appointing a skilled swordsman instead of adhering to traditional methods, thereby portraying Henry's dramatic choice as an act of compassionate consideration. The horror of the execution was systematically sanitized in official records, initiating a centuries-long process of historical revision that continues to shape our perception of Anne's final moments. Perhaps most unsettling to contemporary sensibilities is the rapid return to normalcy for Henry VIII. The very day following Anne's execution, he became formally engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks of sending his second wife to the scaffold, Henry married his third in a discreet ceremony at Whitehall Palace. This callous expediency underscores the execution as merely a pragmatic solution to a political dilemma and had failed to produce a male heir, leading to her elimination and replacement. The personal tragedy of her demise was entirely subordinated to the imperatives of statecraft and dynastic ambitions. The psychological ramifications of Anne's execution extended well beyond the scaffold. In the weeks leading up to her death, she was subjected to incessant interrogation, deprived of adequate sleep, and isolated from her supporters. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister who orchestrated the charges against her, employed methods strikingly akin to modern psychological torture, including disorientation, sleep deprivation, isolation, and the strategic dissemination of false information. By the time Anne arrived at the scaffold, she had already endured a campaign of mental breakdown designed to ensure that she would not mount any significant final resistance. Court records indicate the extraordinary security measures enacted for Anne's execution, which far exceeded what was customary even for high-ranking traitors. The Tower garrison was doubled, and special guards were assigned to oversee the proceedings. Throughout the fortress complex, various positions were established. These measures were not intended to hinder escape. Instead, they ensured that no supporter could make a last-minute attempt to intervene or sway public opinion against the execution. The overwhelming display of force also served another purpose. It intimidated anyone who might sympathize with and into silent compliance with the king's wishes. The execution was scheduled for mid-morning rather than the customary dawn, allowing for maximum attendance by the citizens of London. Although Tower Green could only accommodate a limited audience of nobility and officials, the Tower's prominent position meant that crowds gathered outside could hear the announcement of the execution's completion. Church bells throughout London would then signal the moment of death, creating a citywide acknowledgement of royal authority. This orchestration turned Anne's private suffering into a public spectacle, transforming death into political theater rather than a personal tragedy. One of the most overlooked aspects of Anne's execution is the fate of her co-accused. 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, were executed just days prior to and on charges of adultery with the Queen. Their deaths were intended to establish the facts of Anne's alleged crimes before her own execution, preventing any chance that their final speeches could contradict the official narrative. This coordinated judicial murder of 6 individuals, all convicted based on essentially identical fabricated evidence, represents one of Tudor England's most audacious acts of state violence, a purge comparable to Stalin's show trials centuries later. While Tower Green today features a memorial marking the approximate site of Anne's execution, contemporary records indicate that the actual scaffold was located elsewhere within the tower. This geographical confusion exemplifies how Anne's death has been consistently reframed and relocated, both physically and historically, to support various narratives. The sanitized romantic portrayal of her execution found in popular culture bears little resemblance to the psychological warfare, character assassination, and calculated cruelty that defined her final days in May 1536. The horror of Anne Boleyn's execution lies not only in the physical act of beheading but also in recognizing it as the culmination of a comprehensive campaign aimed at destroying a woman who had ascended too high for Tudor society's comfort. She was not simply executed, she was systematically dismantled, her reputation obliterated, her accomplishments rendered void, and her very existence nearly erased from history. When we analyze the complete context of her final days, the psychological torment, the public humiliation, the calculated theatricality, and the attempted obliteration of her memory, we are faced with a horror that is far more unsettling than the swift stroke of a calamitous sword. From a contemporary psychological standpoint, Anne's execution serves as a case study in state-sanctioned gaslighting and public character assassination. The accusations leveled against her, ranging from adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, to conspiring to poison the king, were so ludicrous that they would never hold up in any modern court. Nevertheless, through meticulous manipulation of public sentiment, strategic use of torture to extract confessions from co-accused individuals, and control over all official narratives, the campaign against her was executed with chilling precision. Henry's government successfully persuaded many that Anne deserved her fate. This systematic manipulation of reality constitutes perhaps the most horrifying aspect of her execution. 5 centuries later, Anne Boleyn's execution continues to captivate precisely because it embodies the intersection of personal tragedy and political calculation. Her death was not merely the conclusion of a life, but a meticulously orchestrated performance aimed at justifying a king's actions and reshaping historical memory. The true horror does not lie in the moment the sword fell, but in the realization of how thoroughly power can rewrite reality. A lesson that resonates uncomfortably in our current era of information manipulation and character assassination. Anne's ultimate tragedy may be that, despite Henry's best efforts to erase her, her death, rather than her life, became her most enduring legacy. In comprehending the full horror of Anne Boleyn's execution, we confront uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and the construction of historical narrative. The sanitized version of her death, a tragic queen meeting a swift, dignified end, serves to obscure the systematic abuse of state power that her case represents. By exploring the psychological dimension of her execution, the calculated torments, the public humiliation, the destruction of reputation, and the attempted erasure of memory, we gain insight not only into today's justice but also into how authority sustains itself through control of both bodies and narratives. In Anne's severed head, we find a cautionary tale about the fragility of truth itself when faced with absolute power. Uncomfortably in our current era of information manipulation and character assassination, Anne's ultimate tragedy may be that, despite Henry's best efforts to erase her, her death, rather than her life, became her most enduring legacy. In comprehending the full horror of Anne Boleyn's execution, we confront uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and the construction of historical narrative. The sanitized version of her death, a tragic queen meeting a swift, dignified end, serves to obscure the systematic abuse of state power that her case represents. By exploring the psychological dimension of her execution, the calculated torments, the public humiliation, the destruction of reputation, and the attempted erasure of memory, we gain insight not only into today's justice but also into how authority sustains itself through control of both bodies and narratives. In Anne's severed head, we find a cautionary tale about the fragility of truth itself when faced with absolute power.